But he's not kidding about the luminaries, by the way. One of the things about being a sustainability director is that we work in so many different areas, and so our knowledge is kind of like, you know, a mile wide and an inch deep. And pretty much any time I come to speak on any topic, the people in the audience often know more about that topic than I do. What we do in sustainability is connect the dots and move from one system to the other and see the connections between them. I hope, first of all, you'll notice that I put my contact information on the opening slide because I normally stay around after the presentation for as long as I can, but today I have to run back to Denver for a 3:15 meeting with the mayor, and so I really do need to be out of here too. But I'd be happy to respond to any questions, emails, phone messages, whatever, after I speak today, so feel free to contact me afterwards. Also, this is a part of the program where in many places, both programs like this in movie theaters, we always tell you to turn your cell phone off. But I actually have a different approach. I'd like you to turn your cell phones on while I'm here because we all want to hear your ringtones. We know that you spend a lot of time selecting them. They do express your own individuality in this world, so please turn them on. You'll get a call. We can stop what I'm talking about up here and discuss the adequacy or lack thereof of your ringtone. Thank you very much for that. My purpose today is to provide some general guidance for the construction and implementation of a meaningful local food program. As you listen to my presentation, particularly for the first part of it, some of you may think, boy, he doesn't support local food at all. This isn't what we're expecting. I will only say, please hear me out, because I do have a particular point of view on local food, and I have been working on it for a long time, really since the beginning of the movement, which was 5 entire years ago. And I say that only halfway tongue-in-cheek because really this local food movement is pretty recent in its development. When I came to Denver 2 years ago, I was creating a new program to replace one called Greenprint Denver, which was Denver's first sustainability program, started in 2006, and Greenprint Denver did not even have a food component. I started working in this area in 2009 while I was at the Mid-Ohio Regional Planning Commission, where we developed the nation's first regional food system assessment and plan. This is actually the executive summary from that plan. It was a regional plan. There had been city plans in various cities across the country. We were the first ones to do it on a regional basis, a multi-county basis. And I'm going to get back to the regional approach a little later, but the plan did win the Trailblazer Award from the National Association of Development Organizations. So they kind of recognized how new this all was. I followed that project up with the Agrarian Urbanist Overlay Project, which Dave mentioned. This was actually a project to design a set of plans for both physical buildings, neighborhood layout, and programs in a urban or inner city neighborhood that was revitalizing. And it was the first program really of its kind. I chose the term Agrarian Urbanist Overlay because it sounded cool. It sounds a lot more technical than it really was, and I told HUD that because they were the ones who funded it. But that program now has actually broken ground, and its purpose was to use these physical facilities and programs at a neighborhood level to make the production, processing, distribution, preparation, and celebration of food the central theme of the neighborhood. The concept was that in order to bring new people in without driving old people out, let me share this. They're probably calling to remind me that I'm supposed to be speaking right now. But in order to revitalize the neighborhood without gentrification, we needed to have a central theme that would appeal to everyone from one end of the socioeconomic spectrum to the other. And so we did it, we produced it, they've broken ground on the first phase. I'm very excited about where that leads. So I have been doing this for a long time, and what I'm going to do today is divide my presentation into 3 parts. The first part I call the 10 Commandments of Local Food. So let's bring that one up, if we can. So these are some general guidelines to kind of distill what I've learned about creating a local food system over the years that I've worked both in Ohio and now here in Denver. It's really designed for audiences that may not be as far advanced as other communities to kind of help them skip some of the growing pains and learning curve that we had to go through both in Columbus and here. And then secondly, I'm going to talk about the local food goals that we've set in Denver and give you a general idea of how we're going about addressing them. And finally, I'm going to conclude with the second 10 commandments, which I can do in a lot less time, called the 10 Commandments of Institutional Purchasing, which is one of the techniques that we use in Denver to advance the local food system. So let's start with the 10 Commandments of local food. The first commandment is don't romanticize. What do I mean by don't romanticize? It's something like this. It's local. Or it's local. Or I just went to a great restaurant last night, the food was fabulous, and it was all local. You know, I found that there's this tendency to romanticize local food as if it's the solution to everything. And I did a presentation on local food 3 years ago at the Congress for the New Urbanism. It was a joint presentation with Andres Duan, the great American planner. And he said something during that presentation which I'll never forget. In talking about local food, he said, it all sounds great until someone has to pick up a wheelbarrow. And there is truth to that because, you know, when you look at the modern food system, which is non-local, and you say, how did it get this way? There's a reason that it is this way. And it's not because of a conspiracy due to the big food companies. A big part of it is that food production is difficult. Growing food is hard work, it's unpredictable, it's risky. Processing food is difficult, risky, can be filled with liability. When you're growing the food, you don't have a regular income. You can't leave to take vacation when you want to. And we've all seen American Gothic. You know the painting American Gothic with the man standing there with a pitchfork and the woman standing next to him in the farmhouse in the background. They're not smiling. There's a reason that they're looking so grim, is that it's a very difficult lifestyle. That plus oil. Oil and everything that it opened up to America, not just in food, but in a lot of other places. That's why the food system is the way it is today. And before you start into local food, you have to remember that. And you don't want to portray food and the production of food as this thing that's going to change all of our lives for the better. It is a tough profession, and we have to remember that as we go into it. My second commandment, don't oversell local food. Or to put it another way, get your facts straight. How many of you have heard, as you've looked into local food, been to programs like this, how many of you have heard something like this? Did you know that the average piece of food on your plate has traveled 1,500 miles to get there? Generally, when I give this presentation, there's a lot of people nodding. They've heard this. Actually, my first day on the job, second day on the job in Denver, when I went to a local food conference, one of the first speakers said, did you know that the average food on your table here in Denver has come 1,500 miles? Well, I started looking into that several years ago because it didn't make sense. It couldn't be true all over the country. It couldn't be true everywhere I was hearing it. So where did that come from? And it turns out that Slate magazine did an article back in 2008 when it was already circulating. It was based on a study done several years earlier, so about 10 years ago now. It was a study done by a professor at Iowa State who studied food arriving at a specific warehouse in Chicago. So it was not studying how far food traveled to anyone's plate, it was how far it went to that warehouse. And it was a pretty undisciplined study. When he did his statistics, he said that, for example, if he was looking at an orange grown in Florida, he would assume that it was grown at the midpoint of the state, whatever state it came from. He wouldn't look at where it was actually grown. He would just assume that if it came from Florida, it was grown right in the middle of Florida. And so somehow we took this study that said the average distance of food arriving at that terminal was 1,500 miles, and we generalized it to the entire food system, and we repeat it all over the country. And in my experience, this happens a lot in the area of local food. A couple of areas in particular, where it happens, where we have to be careful, are in the area of jobs and health. Let me tell you something about jobs. Whenever anyone proposes a new policy of any substance on any subject, the people in favor of that policy are going to say it's going to create jobs. And the people opposed to the policy are going to say it's going to kill jobs. And they're both right. They're both right. Because change, when change happens, some people can forge ahead and adapt to it, and other people fall behind. And that's as true in local food as in anything. You know, food, at least when you look at it from the national perspective, is largely a zero-sum game. There's only so many stomachs in this country. There's only so many stomachs in this world. You can only stuff so much food into them. And yeah, our population is increasing, so there's always, you know, that potential for expansion. But generally speaking, if you're doing a food job in one place, processing or growing it, you're probably displacing that activity someplace else. Now, at the local level, food can create jobs. If you're bringing more of the processing home to Colorado Springs, for example, you very well may be creating new jobs. But probably there's someone else somewhere who's taken an economic hit because of that. We have to, and I'm not saying don't talk about jobs, just be realistic when we're talking about jobs. The same is true of health. You know, I often hear that, you know, if we could just create access to healthy food in the central city, you'd see obesity going down and you'd see diabetes disappearing and all these other things. I've looked at the research on this, and I would say the most realistic thing you can say is that the verdict's not in yet. We really don't know. And frankly, it's pretty hard to set up a trustworthy experiment that would even test that. Because there's a lot of different factors that affect people's health. There's a lot, in food deserts, there's a lot of other things that happen there beyond just food that affect people's health. And so we have to be very careful when we say these things. It's not that we shouldn't address health, or we shouldn't address jobs, or many of the other things, but we do need to get our facts straight. It's kind of an extension of don't romanticize. Okay, number 3 commandment. Stick to a lead agenda. One of the things that we found when we started doing this, and I should mention, by the way, this was the first regional food system assessment plan, but not the best. The best was the one that was done by the Delaware Valley Regional Planning Commission in Philadelphia. Theirs just dwarfs ours. And in our defense, I would say that they received a 7-figure grant from their local foundation, not only to do their study, but then to pass out a lot of implementation money. We got $20,000 from our local foundation and had a lot of volunteers on this. But we were still able to produce it. And one of the things we discovered early on was that you know, the demand really wasn't the problem, the supply wasn't the problem, but there were all of these issues that people were pursuing around food that often were inconsistent with each other. And that created a lot of confusion and could even create conflict. Recently, a group called produced something called the Sustainable Food Cities Award. This is a new award, and I took a look at the criteria. This is a 2-sided page, and this is 1/3 of the criteria that they were using for this award to decide whether you had a sustainable food program in your city. And it was interesting. Just these 2 pages, I was circling all the different agendas that are wrapped up in this, including healthy eating, fresh, local, organic, high animal welfare, meat-free, fair trade, community-based, food deserts, of course, they talked about, poverty, supplying a living wage, increasing food access, affordability, weight, you know, individual weight services, vulnerable people, food deserts, food swamps. That was actually a new term. Maybe some of you have heard of food swamp is like, you know, McDonald's on one corner and a Burger King on another corner and Kentucky Fried Chicken. So apparently there are now not just food deserts, but also food swamps. And to these, I've added some others that often come up. Job creation, which we've mentioned, use of vacant land. Some cities say this is how we're going to solve our vacant land problem. Reduction in greenhouse gases, resilience in the face of peak oil, farmland preservation, and food waste and composting issues. When you get into the area of local food, you start dealing with all of these different agendas. And they're all fine. Any one of them is important, but if at least at the community level you are creating a local food system, you got to pick a lead agenda. You can't try to do all of them at once because you won't be able to. In different communities, it's going to be a different agenda. In Denver, we really emphasize resilience in the face of future food disruptions. That's kind of our driver. That's not necessarily the right driver for your community. And you shouldn't only have one agenda item. It's okay to pursue multiple things, but you need to pick one as the lead item because you will have to make decisions as you get into this. And when we were doing some research last year about local food, we found that when we talked to merchants, there's a group up in Denver called Vitamin Cottage, which is now called Natural Grocers, and their audience likes organic food. And so, they want organic food, and what they told us is there isn't a lot of organic food being produced in Colorado. So we don't do a lot of local food because what our people want is organic. That's fine. If organic is your issue, if that's the basis of your local food program, that's fine. But when you choose the lead issue, the lead agenda item, you may run into some conflicts, and you have to do it strategically. Number 4, plan regionally. Now, I've already discussed the fact that we did this regional food system assessment plan in Ohio, but why did we do it regionally? We are system thinkers. Food isn't just a commodity, food is a system. And the purpose of the system is to supply the nutritional needs of people. We're all familiar with what used to be called the food pyramid and what is now called the food plate by USDA, the different components of a healthy diet, which include grains and starches and proteins and produce and vegetables and fruit and dairy and so forth, meat, and the relative proportion that makes for a healthy diet. And cities are great. We looked at some of the city plans. San Francisco had a great plan, but basically no city can supply the entire food plate or the entire food pyramid within municipal boundaries. They particularly have problems with the grains, things like corn, wheat, flour, the meats, also to a lesser extent dairy. And if your purpose is to provide a healthy food system for your population, you really need to do it on a regional basis and not on a municipal basis. That's the way things have been done historically. I often remind people that the city-state is the oldest form of human organization after the tribe. It goes back at least 6,000 years. And nation-states come and go, but the city-state has always been with us and probably always will be. And there's a central city, but there's also an agricultural hinterland, and they depend on each other. It is not a superior-subordinate relationship. They depend on each other. So that's the way food has existed for a long, long time. And if you're going to address a full food system, you really need to do it on a regional basis. Okay, we're almost halfway there. Point number 5, put someone in charge. I should say put someone in charge at the regional level. Working both in Ohio and here, I found that there's 2 basic ways that local food sort of bubbles up in a community. One is that there's an organization that takes the lead in it. In Columbus, there was a group called Local Matters. It was founded by a former chef who had developed an understanding, through his business of what the problem was with the food system. And he created this nonprofit, and they basically went out to everyone else. They went out to the food bank and to the foundation and to the government and to the universities and so forth, and pulled all the pieces together into a well-organized local food network. Came out to Denver, and what I found here is a different system, what I call 1,000 points of light, which is that there's a lot of different food organizations that have come up independently. They are talking to each other, but there's no real central organizing group the way there was in Ohio. And in my opinion, there really needs to be, ideally at the regional level. But what some communities do, you may have heard the term, the name of community, Food Policy Council. We thought about that in Ohio, but food, as I mentioned, is a system. It's not just a policy. Policy is important, but there are other aspects as well. So the mechanism that we were setting up there at the time I moved was the Regional Food System Council. That was going to be the organization that would draw the rest of them together. They would talk regionally, there would be one food system council in each of the 12 counties, and then they would meet collectively as a regional food system council. So that's one way to do it. But I really feel, based on being in one community where there was a clear leader, and coming to another community where there's a lot of great stuff going on, but there's not that single leader that's bringing everyone else together, that it's important to plan, to have someone in charge. So, number 6, focus on scale. What I mean by scale can be illustrated by something we have in Denver called Blue Bear Farm. If you've been in and out of the Denver Convention Center, the Colorado Convention Center, you know that at the south end of it, there's kind of looks like a community garden. It's not a community garden, but it's a garden that they put in on the grounds of the convention center. And they're growing food there. They're growing food there that's actually used at the convention center, and some of it's given to food banks. And the first year they produced 8,000 pounds of food from that garden, which sounds great until you do the math, until you bring in the denominator. For our 650,000 people in Denver, that's probably less than 1 ounce of food per person per year. So that's great. It's nice that we have Blue Bear Farms. It kind of illustrates what you can do. But if you're really building a local food system, you need to think at scale. You need to think big and move big numbers. Otherwise, you know, it's just a kind of a boutique-y thing to maybe burnish your city's reputation a little bit. But if you're going to do it big. My dad was an instrumental music teacher and musician, and he always used to tell his students, if you're going to make a mistake, make it loud. Because if you're always trying to avoid mistakes by playing softly, you're never going to be a musician. And the same is really true for designing your local food system as well. The 7th commandment, emphasize year-round elements. If you are thinking of food as a system, the food system has to operate year-round because people need food all through the year. So you really need to put focus on those elements that allow you to have a year-round food system. Now, I love farmers markets and I love community gardens, but the community garden only operates for about half the year, and there may be a harvest or two, and then you're done. And the farmers market, many of them, not all of them, but many of them also operate perhaps 6 months a year. If you're really serious about food, if you're serious about creating a local food system or a regional food system, you got to think long term. And in Colorado, one of the big elements of that is you need to extend the growing season. So what that means is things like hoop houses and greenhouses become very important. That's one way of extending the growing season. There's also crops that can be grown indoors, like mushrooms. And so not only operate at scale, but also go to think about the year-round elements of the system. Which brings us to the 8th commandment. You remember 1992, Bill Clinton, it's the economy, stupid? Well, in local food, in my opinion, it's the processing, stupid, and the distribution. What we found when we did this assessment in Ohio, and I mentioned this earlier, is that the demand was actually there. It wasn't that people didn't want or weren't interested in local food. That was really there. And the supply was there too. We had this rapidly growing group of farmers, urban farmers, rural farmers, people who were shifting their crop mix and so forth, who were interested in producing it. One of the dances you do in local food is making sure that the demand and the supply grow at a relative comparable rate. Because if you're pushing demand and you don't have the supply, then your purchasers get frustrated. And if you're purchasing the supply and you haven't developed the demand yet, then you've got a bunch of farmers who are pretty upset because they've taken a risk and they're not getting a return. The missing element that we found there was really the food processing and distribution. Processing, and by processing I'm not talking about making the real fancy frozen turkey tetrazzini dinners, but really the more basic stuff that takes the food produced and turns it into something that lasts years long, or at least weeks or months long. All of those ancient arts that we've had around for centuries, you know, pickling and preserving and smoking and salting, all of those arts, you know, to take produce and turn them into a year-round commodity, that's really important. And the distribution network. A lot of people assume, they say, well, local food, that's going to reduce our carbon footprint. Well, not necessarily. Depends if your local distribution network is efficient or not. Because remember, when I talked about why the food system is the way it is, oil is a big part of that. Scale is a big part of that. And so if you're going to do this at a local level that's competitive, you have to have a distribution network that works locally. And those two things both point towards the food hub. The food hub is where, and there's lots of different forms of food hub, but at the core, they really need to have one or two things. There's got to be a distribution and storage facility, particularly for small producers. People who, you know, the typical farmer's market, the farmer out in the country has to get up super early, load everything into a vehicle, take it all down to the farmer's market, unload all of it, and then at the end of the day, whatever's left, load all of it back on and go back to the farm. That's a difficult job, particularly in light of what you actually earn. These food hubs, these distribution networks, allow you to bring your food into the city when it's convenient to do so, and to leave it there. And so it opens the door to a lot of other things that you want to do with the local food system. There can also be food processing that goes on site in the food hub, and there's a lot of other bells and whistles you can have. Some of them have restaurants attached to them, some of them have farmers markets attached to them, some of them have business incubators with them or educational programs, and that's all great, but at the heart you want to first focus on the distribution and the processing. Which brings me to the 9th commandment. Don't lock yourself into a limiting form. Words are important, and we often use terms in local food or anything else that I work in sustainability that unknowingly may lock us into a particular form. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples of this. First, the farmer's market. When I developed that the Agrarian Urbanist Overlay project to submit to HUD for funding back in 2010, the term we used was year-round farmers market. That we were going to, one of the things we would design would be a year-round farmers market. But as we got into implementation, we realized that farmers markets are a particular type of food delivery service, but there are other types. And we changed the terminology from farmers market to retail facility, because that opened up a lot of other possibilities, including the form that I think they eventually gravitated to, which is something more like Cracker Barrel, a restaurant that also had a big area to sell processed food. So what we liked about that is a restaurant is a year-round facility, and because it was featuring processed food, it was also emphasizing the year-round aspects of food that then opened the door to the other things we wanted to do in the neighborhood, which was teach processing, build processing. By the way, one reason that we put so much emphasis on processing and distribution is because that's where the jobs really are. That you have to do it, and that's where the full-time jobs with benefits are. They're not in the community gardens, and they're not in the farmers markets. There's a market manager, but you really want to create jobs, you really need to focus on the processing and distribution. So we changed the terminology so that we wouldn't get locked into a particular form. And my second example is the USDA food desert. Because as you know, there's a lot of talk about food deserts, and that's a term of art that the USDA uses to describe areas that are a certain distance from the closest grocery store. So that if you're in a food desert, according to the USDA, the only way you can solve it is with a grocery store or a corner store. And I like grocery stores and corner stores, and if you can get them, that's great. But that's not the only way that you can deliver healthy food to people in those type of areas. One form that we're looking at right now with great interest is the food delivery service. There's a company that's recently come to Denver. It's operating in a number of other cities called Instacart. Instacart, you order your food online and they can buy it. They buy it from a variety of different stores. They buy it from King Soopers, they buy from Whole Foods, from Costco, and you can even tell them where you want them to get the food. And they have 2-hour delivery. So they will deliver the food to your home 2 hours after you order it. And the charge for 2-hour delivery is $4, which is about what it costs to take a bus to and from the grocery store. And so to us, the delivery service could really be a way to get healthy food into these food deserts, although USDA won't even count it as relieving the desert. There is, of course, one problem, and that is that the delivery services don't take food stamps. They don't take SNAP benefits. So that's the hurdle that we need to get over, and we're working on it. The latest Farm Bill actually now makes provision for delivery services to accept food stamps after some type of trial or study period that they're going to do. There's already an experiment going on in 2 zip code areas in the Bronx with a delivery service that operates there, where they're already allowing or accepting food stamps as part of the delivery service. I don't know whether it's going to work or not. I can tell you when we went to Instacart and we looked at their delivery area, they deliver in every food desert in Denver. Some of these companies, they won't go to bad neighborhoods, but Instacart will. And they're very interested. They tell us they're very interested in taking food stamps. They can't do it right now, but we're going to be spending a lot of time over the next couple of years trying to open up the delivery market for food stamps. If we locked ourselves into the terminology of the USDA, we would very likely not have even thought about delivery. And it's not the only mechanism. Baltimore tried out a program called Balti-Market, where you could go to your local public library and place a food order, and 2 days later come back and pick it up. So there's that model. There's pedicab businesses. There's Green Bean Delivery in Indianapolis is using bicycles to deliver food. There's a lot of different models. Walgreens in Denver now has a fresh produce section in a neighborhood that's a food desert. From USDA's point of view, that hasn't solved the problem, and yet there's people in that neighborhood who can now get close-up access to healthy food that didn't have it before. So be careful of your terminology. Try and use generic terms. Don't lock yourself into a particular form. And the last commandment, thou shalt not covet. Now, I know you're probably thinking, wait a minute, Jerry, that's the actual 10th commandment. Well, what I mean by this is in local food and a lot of other areas in sustainability, what we covet is the best practice. And I see a lot of well-intentioned local food programs kind of get caught in the quicksand of hunting for the best practice, which can sometimes turn into paralysis by analysis. In a lot of areas of sustainability, not just food, a lot of areas, what we find is that we don't actually need to invent something new. We have to go back to something old that used to work and that we got away from. When I came in, our sheriff's office was talking about they wanted to put in an aquaponics facility where prisoners would grow food for the prison and the community. Did some research. It turns out that Mayor Spear in Denver was doing that 100 years ago. He had prisoners growing food that they were supplying to the orphanage. And so, food is not rocket science. It's not a terribly complex thing. We know what is necessary to have a successful food system. And I find all too many communities kind of put everything on hold while they hunt for that best practice. We don't need best practices. We just need good practices. One of the things I often see that the communities want to do, including in Denver, is we want to go into this neighborhood and we want to do a food system assessment, or sometimes it's called a health assessment, before we do anything. And I've gone back after those studies have been done. I asked the same question: did you find anything that surprised you in that study? And no one has ever told me that they did. We know what the problems are. We know what the causes are. We know what the solutions are. We don't need to wait for the best practice to come down the pike. We just need to put our shoulders to the wheel and get going on it right now. So those are the 10 Commandments. And let me shift now to how Denver is pursuing this. We actually have 2020 goals. The mayor asked me to create some new sustainability goals for the city. We organize them around 12 resource areas. These are the resources that are really basic to the successful operation of your city, your economy, your quality of life, things like water quality and energy and mobility. And we have 2 goals for each. One's a government operations goal, which is what we can do with our own government assets, things like our buildings and our fleet and our personnel and our taxing authority. And then the community goal, which is what we can only do in partnership with our community. I'm going to focus on the community goals. This one has actually been changed once already, and I think it's going to change again. When we first came out with it, it said grow and process. At least 20% of the food purchased in Denver entirely within Colorado. What we found is grow and process was very difficult to measure. Not for some foods, obviously, and you can tell whether an ear of corn was or was not grown in Colorado. But if I go back to that turkey tetrazzini, how do I know whether it was all grown in Colorado or not? Were the breadcrumbs, come from Colorado? Were the noodles? Were the little pieces of celery and so forth? And so we changed it this year to grow or process. Because really what we're trying to do is build resilience into our food system. And as I mentioned before, if processing is so important, then we want to emphasize that in what we're dealing with tactically. So we're going to count food whether it was grown or processed. If it's both, that's great. But even if it was grown out of state, if we have a processing facility in state, that means we have something close by that we can use for our food system in the event of problems or disruptions later on. It's still problematic, however. As we're finalizing the suite of strategies that are going to get us to this 2020 goal, what we're finding with this is, part of the problem is, we're going to do it by dollar value, but there's food and then there's food. If I think of kind of a superfluous luxury, a canned sardine, for example. If we're going to count in measuring this, we're going to count the canned sardine the same as a loaf of bread. But when you are thinking about a food system and basing it on nutrition, there are certain parts of the food system that are really important. You might call it the strategic foods or the critical foods. And the rest of it, like the canned sardines, you can probably do without if you have to. So as we're reformulating this by the end of the year, I'm guessing we're probably going to redefine food as, a kind of a market basket of the most critical, most important foods for people's nutrition. We need to be able to produce that locally. We need to be able to produce it locally quickly. We need to be able to adapt to changes quickly. I wouldn't also be surprised, by the way, that once we define the market basket more narrowly, the percentage will go up. But that's what we're trying to get to. However, we have a second goal, because, remember I talked about different agendas, so this has to do with the production and processing of food, but there's also health goals. And for our community health goal, we want to ensure that at least 90% of children in Denver are not obese. That's what we chose as our health goal. So there's an obvious food component to that. And we could solve, we can do the 20% without addressing food access at all. But that was not satisfying for us. So we also have this health goal, and by the way, currently the number is around, the percentage who are not obese, about 82% right now. And so there's obviously a food access component and a food health component to that, and under each of these goals we're going to nest some strategies. There's one other place that food shows up in our sustainability program, and that's in the executive order that created my office, which includes some policies that go beyond those 2020 goals. And we have a food, section 9.1 says city agencies will source food locally in catering or other transactions and consider on-site food production where cost effective. I'm a lawyer, so there's always some kind of phrase in there that gives you a little bit of an out. We're cost effective, and we all know how that can play out in an institutional setting. But realistically, we are a government entity, and we have other rules we have to follow with respect to bidding and so forth. Nonetheless, those are the three components of our food program. And if I kind of go back through, the Ten Commandments of local food, we try not to romanticize about food, and we don't try to oversell it or make claims about it that we can't justify. We do have a lead agenda, which I mentioned is the resilience of our food system, its ability to withstand disruptions from outside, but also disruptions that may occur right in our region itself. We are trying to plan regionally. I recently persuaded the Denver Regional Council of Government to stick a local foods section into its next 25-year plan. So they are going to be going into local food, not as broadly as I'd like, but they're going into it now for the first time. So we're moving in that direction. We're still looking for someone to put in charge. If it's regional, it can't be the central city. It really has to be a regional player. It doesn't necessarily have to be the Regional Planning Commission, but it needs to be a regional player. Those numbers, we're clearly focusing on scale. We are definitely emphasizing year-round elements. We just submitted to Council a funding package for Denver's first food hub, which I think will be under construction still later this year. We have 3 others in the works. And I have no scientific basis for this, but I believe that ideally you need a food hub for every 50,000 people or so. So we really need 13 of them in Denver. We've got 1 that's definitely going. We've got 3 more that we're really close, and we're pushing to get to 13. So with the hubs, we are putting processing and distribution first. We're doing a lot of work with greenhouses, from small, about 10,000 square feet, to some concepts we're working on for the Denver International Airport that could be a facility of up to 40 acres if we can pull a bunch of things together. We definitely do not lock ourselves into a limiting form. That's why we're looking at the delivery service in our food deserts rather than sticking with the USDA model. And believe me, we're not coveting the best practice. I mean, you heard my philosophy. We want to be working on food right now. We don't think we have to first do a community assessment of all these things before we act. I want to close with the 10 Commandments of institutional local sourcing, because that's one of the tools, one of the very powerful tools that you can use. And here I show them all at once because I can do this in just a few minutes. Basically, every community has 4 major institutions where you can harness their purchasing power. And those are the government, the school system, the universities, and the health system. They have tremendous combined purchasing power. And in some communities, like Colorado Springs, you have a 5th institution, which is the military. We don't really have that in great number in Denver, but we do have it down here in Colorado Springs. So, the basic idea is let's harness that purchasing power to jumpstart the local food system, to create a large enough market so people who are thinking of coming in either as producers or as distributors or as processors or as food hubs will feel more secure in doing so. And there's really 10 things you need to do that successfully. First, you have to understand your objective. We're harnessing institutional purchasing, but for what? Are we going to emphasize the healthiness of the food? Are we going to emphasize organic? Are we going to emphasize locally produced? And that, by the way, brings us to point 2. If you're going to harness it to jumpstart your local system, what do you mean by local? You're always going to get into that, and it means different things in different parts of the country. Here, as you know, we define it as produced or processed in Colorado. And you need to make a list. If you're going to require or influence institutions to purchase locally, they'll say, well, we love to do that, but we don't know where to get the food. So you need to have a list of local producers that you're able to give to folks if you're going down this road. And then I put check it twice, because as we've talked to these institutions, just because an entity is located in Colorado and produces a food product doesn't mean they have the capacity to satisfy the needs of a big institutional purchaser. So you start with your list, but you also have to do some more research to say, all right, who has the capacity to produce big volumes? When you're talking about an institution like a jail, you've probably narrowed yourself down to a relatively small number of producers. A caterer, on the other hand, probably has a bigger source of supply. But regardless, you need more information on your list than simply they're local in Colorado and they produce food. And then you also have to make a list of your institutions. Just in Colorado Springs alone, think of how many higher education institutions there are that could be part of this. Your school system. It's not just the public schools, it's also the charter schools, it's the parochial schools, could be the preschools, could be the summer programs. So you don't just make a list of producers, you also need to make a list of institutions. Then, once you have a list of institutions, you need to know what their schedule of contracts is. Just because your city has decided to require local purchasing doesn't mean you can do it immediately. Out at our airport, the Denver International Airport, we have concessionaires, and they have usually long-term contracts, 3 to 5 years. So they don't all come up at once. And if we're going to put this into their contracts, we have to know when their contracts are coming up for renewal and when we need to get into the RFP, request for proposals, in order to do this local sourcing. Create boilerplate, so you need to find some contractual language that you're going to use over and over again for this. You need to introduce it gently, because you will engender resistance just because it's new. We've always done it this way. Or sometimes you hear, well, we tried that once and it didn't work. So you need to introduce, you don't want to come down with a hammer right away. And then, once you succeed with your own institutions, let's say Colorado Springs gets all of its city institutions doing this, then you export it to other institutions. Then you say, hey, school system, this is what we're doing in our city purchasing, would you be willing to join us? And once you get the institutions in your community to do it, then you look at nearby communities. Then you go to the colleges and hospitals and so forth that may be the next town over. And finally, EPP is environmentally preferable purchasing, and so communities can band together to purchase sustainable products collectively, so they can have some economies of scale and achieve some better prices. That's one of the things that your institutions are going to want. If you can lower their price by combining your purchasing power, that's really going to help your local purchasing program. So that is it. I think we're at the end. I appreciate your attention, because I know I've talked for a long time, and I think we have some time for questions, so let me open it up.
So we do have time. That was really great. I learned a whole lot. No more than I ever will. But I hope we can benefit from it. So we have about 5 minutes, and therefore to get as many questions as possible, let's make them real questions and not
a real quick question, thank you. What part of Columbus, I'm Ohio native, so I was wondering what part of Columbus you instituted your program.
Yeah, well, I grew up in Cleveland and spent basically the first half of my life there and the second half in Columbus. This is the Wineland Park neighborhood. Okay. So Wineland Park is about halfway between Ohio State University and downtown. It kind of edges up against Interstate 71 and railroad tracks. It's only about a third of a square mile. It's about a third of a mile wide and about a mile long. Okay. And it is, it's changing. But so far this program has been pretty successful.
Congratulations.
Let's go back over here.
Yes, I was curious, has your office done any kind of financial projections for your goal for 2020 in terms of what kind of money shift or economic impact this would create for Colorado or local producers?
No, although I know Michael Schumann's here and is speaking. I'm not sure if he's speaking, but Michael Schumann, who's one of your speakers, has done a study which he calls the 25% food shift, which does kind of quantify the economic impact of achieving that kind of number.
I'll bring this up, but it'd take too long.
Yes, on your local purchases on food, do you have a definition or a thought on how you ensure that that food and processing is part of a sustainability model? Is it as opposed to just local?
Do you mean are we going to judge the operation of the actual food producer as to whether they're using too much food or putting out pollution and so forth? Yeah, the answer is no. Or I should say not yet. And that's part of what I talked about earlier, and it's kind of an illustration of the multiple agendas that you can get into with local food. Because there are folks who who feel you shouldn't just accept any food or just base it on the address, or you should maybe emphasize non-meat or whatever. That's completely legitimate, and we may get to the point where we can do that someday, but we've chosen resilience as our lead agenda, and so that's what's going to be driving us, at least for the foreseeable future.
Can we do one more?
Context, Colorado Springs disbanded its sustainability office. So what sort of political support and barriers have you gotten?
Well, different cities are different. I can say, coming from Ohio to Colorado is more than just figuratively or literally a breath of fresh air. It's figuratively a breath of fresh air. This community generally is just so much more attuned to sustainability issues than what I grew up with. But what we're also, it's interesting because I'm speaking this weekend at the American Dream Conference, a libertarian group that's invited me to talk about whether it's even worthwhile to plan for sustainability. And in Denver, at least, we are doing a very prosperity-based, competitive approach. We believe that cities are already competing against each other on the basis of sustainability, whether they know it or not. The ability to secure these basic resources, make them available and affordable for the long term. And for a long time, I just said that theoretically, but actually this week, we are involved in a competition with another major U.S. city for the relocation of a sustainability, I can't be too specific, but it's the sustainability business products division of a major international company. And they actually asked us for a side-by-side comparison of how we perform in sustainability indicators versus the other city. So I've talked about it theoretically for a long time now. It's happened. I think this is just the first time it's happening. And I mentioned a few moments ago, we tried it once and it didn't work. We had a sustainability director and it didn't work. I wouldn't let any community, I would advise every community not to let that discourage them from pursuing it again. There's a lot of different reasons why that may have happened, but competition among communities on the basis of sustainability is real and it's permanent. And my guess is if this community went away from it, they'll find their way back to it.
Thank you very much, Jerry.
Thank you.